soon as it says starting recording. All right, so here we are again with the Best Book Club, the podcast where I, Selim, aka New Fatora, talk about whatever story, book, literature I feel like talking about this episode. And this episode, once again, the ever-recurring guest, the infallible, amazing, ever-important member of the Wedgie community, Hans Gutherson.
Hi, everybody. I'm back, and we're back.
Yes, we are. Once again, and it is always fantastic talking to you.
So great to be on. Always love to chat about stories, the community, and chat with you, one of my favorite writers.
It's just the fact that you say that is like, part of me doesn't believe you because of how big in the community you are, and just how much on a certain level I kind of idolize you with the quality of work you've produced, and most of that, I will be honest, comes from Lucy and Daniela. You'll always say that YWNR is the best story you ever wrote, your opus magnum, but Lucy and Daniela, by far, is the best story you've ever written. I can't deny it.
I love that. That's great.
It has been a long time since I read YWNR, I'll be honest, and I'm as a little teaser for an upcoming episode, I will be covering YWNR with some very special guests. It may be one special guest, it may be multiple, but so the listeners here, and as I've seen on the statistics on YouTube, most people only listen to the first minute and a half or so. So it's good to get out of the way now. Teaser for a future episode. An extremely well-known guest will be on this podcast. I won't say who. You can guess that yourselves. And maybe it'll bring you back from future episodes. Anticipating, oh, it might be this episode that the guest is on. Oh, it might be this episode that the guest is on. And then you'll see when the episode finally comes out. Marketing 101.
Can't wait.
But anyway,
I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. But anyway, we're here to talk about one thing specifically and not anything else. And that's what the podcast is all about. And that is, this episode, we are continuing our discussion about Karate Friends by Seseta. One of the most well-known, I hope, stories out there. It should be, if it's not. And one that has left a very huge lasting impact and legacy on, at the very least, myself and Hans. And Hans is, as I said before, one of the most important members of this community, rivaling JR. And so I would say they are the two most important members of this community in the entire time that it's been alive. And so if a story like that has left such an impression and lasting impact on such an important member of this community, it really should not be one overlooked, and it should be one given its full attention, even if it is on an out-of-the-way, at this point, backwater recess of the Wedge community. Luckyfetish. Please go and check out that website. It needs some love.
Yeah. If I can jump right in there, though, because you sort of set me up very well with that in terms of its significance and its impact and its legacy. One thing I want to make sure we hit on in this discussion, something that came to me in talking about Karate Friends more and going over it and thinking about Lucy and Daniela, which you mentioned, is sort of reading back over Karate Friends. I realized Lucy and Daniela could sort of be considered a spiritual successor to Karate Friends. There's some aspects to the story in terms of character arcs, sort of people who begin as enemies and sort of bully and nerd relationships to becoming friends and then eventually teaming up to sort of take down the bigger bads, and the friendship that are formed through wedgies that are very similar to Karate Friends. And I, when talking about sort of how Karate Friends could end if Seseta ever came back to it, or in my sort of headcanon for it, I always pictured everybody coming together and fighting, having a big epic battle with wedgies to sort of end the blackmailing and end all the drama once and for all, and everybody sort of ends up as friends or as lovers, and they all live happily ever after, which is very much sort of what happens in Lucy and Daniela in a lot of ways, where it's a school-wide wedgie war that sort of breaks out. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about stories like that came out before I was writing as much. When we talk about Karate Friends, we're talking about something that was posted throughout 2014, and Lucy and Daniela was beginning of 2015. I really think it definitely had a big impact on me, so it's cool to be able to examine that and talk about its significance.
Yeah, and it's really interesting now that I really think about it, because when you mentioned it before we started talking, it really, I was like, I was very interested to see how you would go about explaining that, and I didn't really connect the dots. And now that I, like, you sort of laid out the points, and I'm thinking, and I'm really thinking about it, it's like, wow, that is honestly the parallels are there, and I honestly, you've changed my viewpoint about it. It really does. It definitely seems a lot more like a spiritual successor than I thought.
Yeah, when I was first thinking about that, it really did sort of dawn on me like Lucy and Daniela could be the ending of Karate Friends in a way. Like, obviously, it sort of covers similar beats, and as I mentioned, and friendship developing through wedgies, which fans of mine know is a theme that I only realized after writing a lot with someone they seem to be somewhat obsessed with, in terms of it appearing in like Lucy and Daniela, YWNR, Teacher Wedgie Fight, and a few other stories where it's like people started out kind of separated, and then wedgies would happen, and they'd end up forming friendships or deeper connections and loves through that. But looking at my story, there's some parts and aspects of it that I think you can look at and sort of interpose, if that's the word, or sort of juxtapose with Karate Friends and find some parallels, as you mentioned. Like, I think last time we chatted about this, I mentioned Nee and Christina and Lucy and Daniela, these two bullies, who one of their quirks is they say obviously a lot at the same time, and they're basically the same person. And we sort of see similar characters in Devora and in the story. But
When
Devora, yes, Gwen and Devora, thank you. But we see obviously Devora take on a more powerful role of her own, and then characters like Amanda, who sort of extorts people for wedgies, and we sort of get that with Devora extorting Rachel near the end, and they both take a more sort of cartoony approach in how many wedgies there are and their sort of view of the world when we talk about like what Earth this takes place
Mhm.
in, like in other episodes you've done. It definitely sort of falls within that same sphere, I think, of realism. um, and then you get details like the hot teasing during like the first wedgie, for example, in Lucy and Daniela, where Daniela's taunting her throughout. We get similar bits with Angelica in Karate Friends when she started giving Mandy the first wedgie we see her give. So definitely some parallels, I think, that I hadn't really noticed until I was very like carefully reading over it and talking with you about it. So it's interesting to think is right. What influences our work? What sort of feeds into what we create?
Yeah, there are multiple points that I want to touch on there. It's I don't think you can really say which character grouping is better, Gwen and Devra versus, was it Brittany and Taylor?
Taylor was
No, Taylor.
not a
Yeah.
bully. It was
Taylor was
Brittany and
Taylor.
Christina.
Christina,
Yeah.
yes, Brittany and Christina. I think those two. I don't think they can really be compared that much because Brittany and Christina are biological twins, and so especially in Lucy and Daniela, which, oh, we're talking so much about it, and I want to save that for a whole other podcast entirely because there's so much to talk about with it. Brittany and Christina really, I think, are two sides of the same coin. And so you take away one side and it's worthless. And I think I said this in the previous episode, where was it Brittany or Christina that tried to keep going after Daniela had wedgied one of them?
Honestly, it's been so long since I wrote that. I want to say Christina, but I could be wrong.
Well, whoever it was, one of them got wedgied severely by Daniela, and the other one tried to keep going as if they were together as always, and it just fell completely flat, and the power of the twins was lost because they weren't twins and they weren't in sync anymore. And I thought that was so powerful. But with Devra and Gwen, originally, they were just the cronies of the big bad boss, Angelica. And then when Angelica is taken down, then Gwen sort of, I felt like really got pushed to the side, and Devra was the one who got the characterization, and she sort of became the mastermind, the person pulling the strings behind the scene. And she did sort of become, was it the Amanda? Was it Amanda that was like the person who holds secrets?
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right.
Yes, okay, so yeah. And so Devra was like a bigger Amanda because she would kind of manipulate other people into giving wedgies for her and bullying people, like with whatever her name was. Oh, that Sasha.
Yeah.
She just sort of complimented her a little bit, and then Sasha obviously must not have gotten compliments before, or she must not have gotten any sort of feedback on her bullying, and so she just automatically took it and was like, wow, that's fantastic. And they formed that partnership, or I guess like a boss and a henchman, because Sasha ended up a little like right at the very end. Sasha was sort of introduced, and at the very, very end of the story, she sort of started taking orders from Devra.
Yep.
And I would have loved to see the character development in Devra, especially if the story was given today, with how much the community has progressed in terms of quality content. It would have been so fantastic to see today.
Yeah, it would have been cool. And yeah, definitely a very, very different story from Lucy and Daniela. So not to belabor those points, but it was influential for sure on it and me, I think, in a lot of ways, like I mentioned. But yeah, it would be cool to see how these things continue and develop. Devora, or Devora as I pronounce it, I feel like her arc was definitely like one of the most interesting parts of the story. She definitely did sort of become worse than Angelica ever was that we saw, at least. And she was sort of blackmailing people into doing these things that they clearly didn't want to do, and really sort of, yeah, turn Sasha into her sort of minion who could give massive and very insane wedgies and stuff. So really would have been interesting to see where she went from there, if she continued to sort of reveal other aspects of her character, or just continued to be like super intelligent and calculating, and then how they would have taken her down eventually and what that would have taken.
Yeah, I would hope that if Seseta ever decided to go back to Karate Friends, and as much as it disappoints me to say, I really sincerely don't believe he ever will. I think if he ever did, I feel like Devra would have some kind of fall from grace like Angelica did, but on a much bigger scale. It really felt like Seseta was really planning for Devra to be the sort of big bad. Like Angelica was the first boss, and she was taken down. And now it's Devra who gets to step into the spotlight and show her skills. And so I wonder if it really would have been a showdown between all of the main characters. And I say that because I can't remember all the main characters' names.
Like Madison, Rachel, Mandy,
exactly.
and
Yeah.
being the four main women who come together.
Yes, they team up against Devra, Gwen, Angelica, and I think Seseta would have introduced someone else
I could see
on the quote-unquote bad side.
Yeah, because Sasha in a lot of ways is like very similar to his character Alice, who's like very similar in physique, this very tough woman who's maybe not the most intelligent, which we maybe see with Sasha, like you mentioned, like joins their team of bullies right after getting like one compliment. So you're kind of like, wow, she might be like this Alice sort of character. So I could see maybe some other similar characters maybe joining into the fray. Maybe they get a fourth bully who Devora somehow recruits, but I definitely picture it ending in this sort of big battle where the karate finally really does come in handy, and they're able to beat up the villains and outwedgie them, and then they all live happily ever after, with the bullies sort of giving up their evil ways.
Yeah. I mean, just judging from the way that the story went, like I said in the previous episode, it really seemed like Seseta came up with the story title based on the first part of the story and did not have long-term plans for it.
Yeah.
I really feel like he just continued on with the story because it was so popular and he didn't want to let down people, or something to that degree. But yeah, I mean, in the interest of staying on Karate Friends and not straying too far into future episode territory with Lucy and Daniela, what in on the topic of titles, we discussed this very slightly at the end of the previous episode. What sort of legacy in general do you think titles should leave with readers?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, especially when you're asking me, a writer who probably more than some of the other writers and other creators you'll chat with on the podcast will have answers to. Because I struggle with titles a lot. Like YW and R was one. I just went back and forth. Like, what would the letters be? When I realized like it would be the letters. Or Lucy and Daniela probably isn't the most original title I could possibly have come up with, since it's just their names. But in terms of what legacy they should leave, I think you obviously want them to be impactful, something memorable, something that I think does maybe resonate in a couple ways in a story. So when you think like a luckily unlucky, that right away sort of draws up a couple images. Even if you don't know what the story's about, you can sort of picture some idea of what could happen and who the characters are going to be. Or like a sore winner, that's a bit of a double entendre in a way too, which is very clever. So if there's something smart, something you go like, wow, that's an interesting title. Usually if they're shorter, they can maybe be more impactful too, or they really mean something that people say like, what does that mean? Like in the case of YWNR, one of the biggest questions I get on that is, what does that mean? You clearly they haven't read the story, or they just didn't care to read the whole thing. So you think like, all right, that's cool. And you get them interested in maybe what the story is.
Real
But
quick, in case anybody doesn't know, and it has been a very long time, like the last time that I read the story was when it came out.
yeah,
So, in case anybody doesn't know, can you tell us what it stands for, or
No.
would you rather
no,
leave
won't do it.
it?
Nope, can't tell
You
you.
didn't even
You
wait for
gotta
me to
read
finish
it.
the question.
No, you gotta. No, like I said, it's one of the biggest questions. Again, I won't do it. You
Yeah.
gotta read it.
Okay.
You
Hey,
gotta read it.
I'm glad that you stick to your guns on that.
Definitely, I'll answer any question
I-
you ask me. But except for that
Except
one.
what is what? Except what is YW start for?
Yeah, but back to
yeah.
your question very quickly to sort of wrap up
Yeah.
what I was saying in terms of impact. I wonder if, like in the case of May Payne's Friends Sessions, if that title was maybe influenced by Karate Friends. Maybe at the same time, I think on Luckyfish forums there was a bunch of stories with friends in the title, because I think I'm not the only one who's very much interested in this theme of friendships being formed through wedgies. I think seseta and a bunch of the writers who write in the so-called Edgin universe on DA are very much interested in that too, with a lot of their stories. Like Sleep All of Today, for example, to name one. So I wonder if there's maybe some of that, if just the very simple idea of karate and friends sort of works, because it sort of sets up that the story's about two very different things, karate and friends, which is clever. And at the same time, it's memorable, short and sweet. And I think years later, 6, 7 years later now, today, it still stands out in our mind as a story. And when we hear that title, it brings back instantly some memories. So I think that's the best thing you want to do. Obviously, the story has to back up the title, but if the title is strong enough, it's going to, I think, evoke some good memories in you.
Well, and I think something you said there, it should relate to the story. Something that I'm not sure if that's entirely true to every story, to every memorable story. Because it may just be because I dissect it and like I gave so much feedback to Excommunicado by Wedgie74, the first episode I did, throwback. And discuss it on my podcast, but that's a story I'm not going to forget. And in a couple certain ways, the title does maybe a little bit connect to the story, but for the 99% of it, it doesn't. It's just a title for the story, and yet I'm going to remember it for a very long time, if not always. So, at the same time, though, I mean, going along with the specific legacy of the title Karate Friends, it sort of influenced how I titled my first story, Fortunate Events. I mean, I wonder if it really was. I'm not entirely sure how I came up with the title.
Maybe you like
I think
Lemony
it was
Snicket's, a series of unfortunate events.
I mean, maybe. I don't think it really was that though.
I took a guess. I took a step. But it's a good title. Yeah, it sort of gives you like that instant thought of like, what there's probably going to be some good things happening to a character. And in your case,
Hmm.
it's kind of ironic because a lot of bad things happen to characters. But it
Yes,
sounds like overall some
but
good things are happening, which is cool.
but I, this is the most I will give of foreshadowing to the story before I put it out. The title does reflect what happens to the character. Good things will happen to her eventually. I know I've given Riley a lot of bad shit, and that is on purpose.
Nice.
Because it leads to good things. So brushing over that entirely. I hope nobody heard that. So when I was trying to think of a title for my first story, I had written out the entire first part, which, I mean, that first part was not well at all. And I mean, part of me is like, I kind of want to say it was on purpose, but it really wasn't. It was just, I'm not good. I am very not good at writing female dialogue that is happy. I'm pretty good. I'm really good at writing sad and depressed female writing because that's what I have experience with. So, Karate Friends was one of the stories that was most influential on me. Just one of the stories that I remember the most from everything that I've written, because, like I said before in the first episode, at the time, it was one of the most unique and just absolutely crazy stories to come out, just one of the best quality stories to come out. So you hear that, and then you look at what's produced now. Just as a side note, that should really tell you the distance that the community has come since then. Because, I mean, I think we talked about it before. I mean, looking back on the story, it's really not written that well. But it stays with us for a reason. Because at the time, it was one of the pinnacles of the best you could write. And it drove people to push further and go to higher lengths and better quality than anybody had done before in that community. And one of those people to profit the most from that was Hans Gutherson, and that shows so highly in his work.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. We could debate, and we've done it, and we could debate certainly for hours on the skill of the community in 2014 versus today. And you're always going to have good writers, and you're always going to have ones who aren't as great. And before Karate Friends came out, as we pointed out in the first episode, there were top tier stories that stand up against like probably any of the stuff coming out today from writers like Refreshing Lemonade, for example, or like the JCCWs who have been writing more recently. And when you have stuff like Auntie Cherry's work, for example, or nicely done stories. But certainly, yeah, those were all very much influential on me, just as writers today are. But Karate Friends, yeah, if you like to read, and I think it's worth looking at Lucy and Daniela through maybe that lens of like, it could be a Karate Friends sequel. It's definitely fair to say Seseta was always a big influence on me, and he definitely did, as you say, push me to go further, which is what everyone in the community, I think, should be doing. I think as a community, it has to be this evolution of movement from story to story, writer to writer, pushing the next writers to be better than we were, you and I, so the next generations knocking us out of the park so we have better stuff to read, which is, I think, partly why we got into this. Those of us who truly treat it as a craft, it's because we wanted to read really good stuff, and we realize like, hey, let's write the stuff we want to read. And then we see writers who are just sort of doing it better and really impressing and doing amazing things that we hadn't expected or thought about when we started out, like interactive stories or like visual novels in the case of Between Two Cheeks and stuff. So it's really cool to see it evolve, and it's cool to think like Karate Friends could be a seminal piece for some of the writers today, including you and I, who are writing, and what that spawns.
Yeah, I think I am, as much as you talk me up, I really am not a very important part of the community. Maybe I will eventually become with this podcast, but who knows? I mean, that's not what I'm going for.
Nice.
And my writing certainly is not something that will inspire writers. It's definitely seems like it's held more of a place in the old heads of the community, I guess, at this point. Because you, Hans, will never let the very first line of a story, the very first story that I wrote for this community, the very first part of Fortunate Events, endless sexual energy. He will never let it go. And it's the very first line that I ever wrote for this community, ever. I don't know why. I'll never understand why fully, but he will always bring it up, no matter the opportunity.
You'll see as you keep writing, you'll find eventually, because it takes a while, to realize that you are an influence on people, and you probably are already with the fact you've been doing this podcast and you've been talking to people, and the fact you have been writing. The thing is, it just takes a while for that word to get back to you, so to speak. And I've talked to you about this, but I've been lucky that I've got to hear from people who were influenced by me, they tell me, or really, really much liked what I've done, and that spurred them on to write. But it happens. As soon as you do anything, you're going to find a writer who's coming up and who reads what you do. And even if you think, oh, it's not my best work, or I'm not done this story yet, but I'll finish it eventually, they're going to read it. And somebody at some point is going to be touched by it. That's how these things go. If the stuff's good, like if you put a bit of yourself in it, it's going to resonate with people. So there's a good chance you've already inspired some people. And the more you keep putting out content, and this goes for everybody out there, the next Sesetas and the next hannsguthersons who are going to go beyond what we've been doing, you are going to inspire, and you're going to be inspired. And I think that's a beautiful part of this community that we often don't realize as writers, because it can be hard when you're not seeing the comments, you're not getting the feedback that you want. But it's out there, and people more often than not are going to be touched and just not tell you about it. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen though.
And that is very true. You don't always get the feedback you want. You don't always get the views, the comments, whatever. You don't always get that pointed at a very specific person that I won't name. So, but at the same time, so on one thing, I'm very happy that you recognize yourself as someone who will be like the next you, because there will definitely be someone who is the next most important person in the community, but they will not be you, because you broke so much ground. And at least, I guess, looking at it now, I don't see how much ground there. I don't see how much more ground there can be to break in terms of putting out different kinds of content or just improving the quality of the work. Because at this point, I really do feel like some of the content creators are approaching the author level, like New York Times bestseller level.
Sure.
And you see
Yeah.
something else.
That's a sad
hits
thought,
me.
though. The idea that we're sort of maybe there isn't more to experiment, and I won't believe it. I've got to think like,
Yeah, no,
who would have thought 5 years
absolutely.
ago visual novels, right, was a
Oh
thing
yeah,
we would
and, like,
ever see, and then we see it. So I like to think like, and I don't want to sound arrogant by saying the next me. I mean, whoever comes next, they're gonna be
no,
outwriting
absolutely.
me.
It's
They're gonna be beating me. But I like to think we're gonna see in future writers experimentation, and even from us, right? We're not done yet. We can continue to experiment, try to find new ways to create content, more interactive stories, maybe going into that. I'm really looking for things that haven't been done. Like podcasts is only something that was like a year or two old, really, when I started doing it. And what else could we do? Those are the questions that I think we might be answering in the new writers to come. I think as they
well,
are younger than us and stuff.
so so many things to talk about there. First of all, there will you. I will say this to the end of time. You are one of the most important people in this community. JR was the person who allowed this community to exist. And that is one of the most important things to ever happen in this community. You came in during this full technology era, giving all kinds of people feedback, breaking grounds into so many different things, podcasts, increasing the quality of writing there is on multiple different multiple different websites, DeviantArt, Luckyfetish, Wedgie Haven, Wedgie Buddies. I don't even know what all you're part of. Contests. And I don't even know if I can't keep track of everything you've been part of because you're part, you become part of so many different things in some way or another. You support so many different things that it's you need a wiki page to
And
describe everything done.
as you maybe know, I started
No,
like
I
a
don't.
Wedgie Fetish
It's
community wiki that I
no,
started, and
I
has a
don't.
couple pages, and it's kind of been dead and quiet for many years. Because no, I thought it might take off and never
Share
really
that.
did,
Share
but
that.
I did
Share
start
that, and I will post it. I will put it in my description of this. I will link it to this podcast.
And that was mostly
For
the sort of be like, look at the good things I did. But we had a couple writers add some details about themselves and works they've done and stuff to it.
That's something that's got to start happening. We have to start chronicling. We have to start I am 100% serious here. We got to start putting down what goes on in the community so that we have a record of it, because it's not a small thing. It's to anybody who's listening to this, somehow came upon my podcast first. Somehow, you're not alone. This is not a small thing. No matter who thinks the wedgie community is small, it is very large. It feels small until you get onto the right forums, like DeviantArt. I wish I could say Luckyfetish, but it's dead. And you have to go. Please, please, please go to Luckyfetish. I will always say that.
Nice. Well said.
JR is the storehouse of knowledge of the formative years of the UIG community, and we need to chronicle this fetish because It's constantly growing. And it started out from nothing. And look at where we are today. We have podcasts, stories, videos, cartoons, animations, contests, visual novels, actual novels. We have content in so many different forms of media. And it's increasingly, if you pay attention to social media and the news and whatever other platforms there are, it is increasingly becoming a more accepted and more well-known fetish. It's like people actually understand, who are not part of the fetish, they actually understand that this is something that turns people on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something that's bad. It's not something that people should be ashamed of, or that people should be scared of. It's just a natural thing, and I'm sorry to go off on a tangent and just kind of block you out of the conversation for a little bit, Hans, but I gotta do this because I want people. I need people to join this community. It's the more people that we have, I think, the better, because even if you get some bad people, and like, as I'm talking about everything, take notes. So if you have anything you want to talk about, we can go back to it. But even if we get some bad people, overall, if we get, I mean, this is kind of based on like, we get more good people than bad, but if we're able to get more good people than bad, then the good people will eventually weed out the bad people. And I mean, it's never going to be like 100% like a happy, no stalker, no creeper kind of zone, but
sure.
I mean, all right, I guess that's the end of it.
No, it's well said. That sums up, I think, so much.
It's not well said at all.
No,
I was just all over the place.
It was good. No, it was good. It's something I think we all need to be thinking about more, how to build up the community.
Absolutely. Okay. So, I mean, we never really finished our conversation about the importance of titles. I think we kind of strayed away from that a little bit. I think somehow I got off on something else, and then we just went off somewhere else. But so when I was coming up with the title for my first story, I had karate friends in mind because of the title. It was simple. It was short. You could easily remember what it was about, even if the title was not necessarily correlated to the entire story. I remembered just from hearing that title, that's exactly what the first part was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so when I because I wrote out the whole first part, and then when I was thinking about a title for it, I don't think I had any working titles for it. I just sat and thought about it, and I think on my my first post, I said like I wrote this at 3 a.m. or something. And so, I mean, that's partially why the quality is kind of bad. But I was also on Luckyfetish at the time, like while I was writing the story, and just the fact that it was 2 words, just 2 simple words, and it described exactly what the story was at that moment. It kind of got stuck in my head of like, this is what a title should be. And then, as I was writing the story, the entire rest of the very basic outline came to me of the rest of the story. It's progressed far past that. Like 50% of the story that I've written since then, or more, no, like 75% of the stories that I've written since then has not been part of the original story, the original outline that I came up with. But the original outline had a couple of things happen, and then the ending. And I thought of the ending and how those things happened in between. And then I came up with the idea of fortunate events, because all of the bad things that happen to the main character help her grow and lead her to a better path in life than where she was when she began the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, it's kind of crazy how well that's still worked with the amount of bad shit that I've given Riley, but it still works just as well. And it might have even been like, I don't want to say destiny, but it was like, it was somehow, I don't know how I was able to pick such a, to this day, more and more as I write it, and even between hiatuses and very long, month-long hiatuses that I hate, it's kind of crazy how much more every part fits into that title. Because I'm going to keep giving her shit. I'm going to keep giving her more and more shit. I'm going to give Riley a couple of good pieces, but she's going to get a lot of shit. I'll tell you that.
Nice.
And so that's really how Karate Friends, the title, has influenced me. Have you seen any sort of influence, whether you have legitimately, like, actually been confirmed to have seen it, or like you think it's there? Have you seen any sort of influence in other writers' titles because of the Karate Friends title?
I threw out a couple that felt similar to me, like Friends Sessions, just in the simplicity of it, that I wonder if subconsciously Anime Panties, who was certainly around and reading that story when it came out, if he maybe was touched by it. And as I mentioned, there was quite a few fictional stories with friends in the title. Trying to think of some. There's some that probably don't stand out, like The Nerd's Friend, like very simple titles like that were on there, that I wonder if they don't, like, if they were inspired by it, I should say. But I can't say for sure, like people saying, oh, this title was so inspirational or so influential, I named my story in honor of it. But I have to wonder when I see simple two-word titles or something like or maybe if his title even came from something else, like stories like Wedgie Friends Forever that were written prior to that, like if he was maybe inspired by it himself, Seseta, if that's where the title maybe came from. Because there's definitely a lot of kind of similar titles with friends in there. But it's a good question, one that definitely, when you talk to Seseta, maybe he'll have seen some examples or have some examples of how he was inspired for that title himself.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm ever able to get Seseta on my podcast, oh, that would be something. But that is actually a really interesting question. If he was actually, because we've talked so much and so in depth about the legacy and inspiration that Karate Friends has given to so many writers. I haven't actually stopped to think about, like, if Seseta was inspired by someone to write these things.
Good question.
That is such an interesting topic. Do you see any inspirations from other writers or other stories in Karate Friends?
Yeah, it's hard to quantify, but I think my guess is some of the action that we saw in the stories like Sore Winner and Luckily Unlucky, in some of the sort of taunting dialogue, even in some later parts of Luckily Unlucky with I forget her name now, but there's some characters. It'll come back to me as we're talking. I wonder if there was maybe some influence on him because those stories were obviously huge on Luckyfish forums, and it'd be hard to miss them. So I could see some of Auntie Cherry's work and influence in some of the teasing and the way he maybe is so detailed in his descriptions of wedgies at times and creative in the different wedgies that happen, which is very much an Auntie Cherry trait in doing a lot of different things. And we see some of that in like the hot and double entendre hot pizza wedgie fight in Karate Friends. So I
Oh,
wonder if
okay,
there's maybe
so
some of that.
real quick, I just looked this up. I'm gonna look up the other one as well. So, Luckily Unlucky
Hmm.
came out on September 12th, 2011 by Auntie Cherry.
Yeah.
And then Sore Winner was the other one. Just so you know, as a very shameless plug, this I'm looking up on Luckyfetish forums, and you should absolutely look up these stories on
Yeah.
there. Let's see here. And wow, Luckily Unlucky came out in September 12th, 2011.
Yeah. My
Also by
guess is
Auntie
there's
Cherry.
maybe. It's hard to say because for all I know, maybe he's never even heard of these writers. But my guess is like the stories were so popular, Auntie Cherry, so well known on Lucky Fish forums. It's one of the top tier writers ever. That I
Yeah.
imagine there might have been some influence for him in there
Oh yeah,
and the actions and the way he
absolutely.
describes things. And I can maybe, if you were to dive really deep into it, I imagine you'd maybe find some similarities beyond what I've been touching on, I think potentially.
Yeah, and I mean, as hard as it is to believe, Lucky Fetish forums back in the day was the place to go for wiki content. So and DeviantArt was not like we were not spread out like we were.
Mm.
We weren't fractured like we are now. So the biggest creators were on there and they were posting their content there. And so other big names were seeing those stories and they might have been inspired by them and they might have decided, hey, I'm going to write because of this. And they just haven't been given an interview yet on a podcast. And maybe that'll happen on this
Hmm.
podcast. Who knows? Who knows? I hope so.
Nice.
But wow, we've talked so much about not karate friends. Is there anything that we have not talked about karate friends that you would like to touch on?
I think we covered a lot. Some of the biggest aspects I think worth mentioning, Devora's arc and the sort of a reason to have me on to talk about why I sort of see it as a Lucy and Daniela spiritual successor, but definitely been a influential and seminal story, and I'm glad we were able to talk about why.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I I don't, as far as I recall, I don't think I've run into anyone who I've mentioned the story to and they say they haven't read it before. Probably I probably run into people like that, but it's, if nothing else, I hope this second episode, if you weren't convinced from the first episode talking about Karate Friends, the fact that there even is a second episode talking about Karate Friends, I hope that's enough to convince you, and if not, I hope this discussion was enough to convince you, even though we talked mostly not about Karate Friends. But at the end of the day, I think that really is a hallmark of how well the story has stuck with us and how big of a legacy it's had, because we're able to talk about so many things relating to Karate Friends that have potentially been inspired by it, and the fact that both of us decided to either start or keep going or improved our stories because of it really should be a driving factor towards reading it.
Well,
If don't compared to today's writing, it really is nothing to write home about. It would not hold up to today if it was released today. But you in the terms when we're looking at these sort of quote unquote classic stories, you really do have to keep in mind the time period that it was released and look at all of the other content that was released at the time and see how far above it was.
yeah, the
And I
story
think,
definitely is still, as you point out, maybe not the most well written story ever. It's still fantastic wedgies in there, really cool beginnings of arcs and interesting sort of character changes that, as we mentioned, are very influential on me and a lot of the work I've done, I think, over the years, and I'm sure other writers who came on the Luckyfish forums as well. And yeah, it's for me, it's not so much time period of when it came out, because as I said, even before this, years earlier, there were stories that were excellent and still I think are some of the best works to come out of the community for their influence, and stories by Auntie Cherry, for example. Um, but for Seseta's case, there's things like English as a second language and some of those challenges that presents. But the fact he writes, and to this day, so compellingly and has continued to grow as a writer, it's interesting to look back at this early work he did and maybe see some ideas of like characters that he would later write about more, and how he would sort of evolve and what topics he would tackle and what his stories would sort of come to look like today. Because I feel like Karate Friends, you can see the fingerprints from this on a lot of his work today, which is very interesting.
definitely. I mean, I think today Seseta has sort of fallen into a groove of stories that he writes. He kind of follows the same, he's kind of formulaic with his writing. And to a certain degree, he kind of, I mean, I guess not to a certain degree, but he is very successful with what he does. And I think he's recognized the whole niche that he's filled, and I kind of hope that he strays away from it a little bit.
Interesting.
You
Yeah, I
know,
could see the formulaic that you mentioned being part of working on commissions as frequently as he does and having to
yeah,
meet sort of the demands people want, which are often very extravagant, but also
hmm
when you're working on sort of what I imagine is the tighter deadlines that he does to sort of turn around so many stories for a certain amount of money, it does maybe lend itself to falling back on sort of these formulas in the case of maybe some of his more recent Overwatch stories that are very much straightforward and to the point and don't spend much time developing characters, because most of the people reading them are going to be familiar with the Overwatch characters to begin with, for example. But yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up about how he sort of evolved as a writer, and we could spend a very long amount of time on that and where he sort of stands now in his writing, and what could be the next stage for him. But I guess we writers go through phases, and this is an interesting one from him to see him put out so much content so frequently, I think.
Oh yeah, and I think he's testing the boundaries a little bit, because he did sell that that collection of short stories a while back, and he sold his, like, I guess, quote unquote novel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did.
More recently. I would qualify it as a novella. And so I think he's trying to branch out a little bit, and he's working on bigger projects, but
excellent.
At the same time, he's sticking to the safe zone, which I guess is the target area for a lot of writers. But it's not something that I ever want to get into. I don't ever want to be the person writing piece by piece, individual pieces about specific characters, and never being able to give them the time to develop and grow, especially if they're not my own characters. And I would not, if I was writing a story about characters that were not my own, I would feel so much pressure to write exactly how the people who wrote them before me did. Like, if, like, a lot of the newer stories that I've seen have been Star Wars kind of things, like, those are professional script writers, and they go through so many edits, the scripts themselves, and there's so many people working on those scripts to make them as perfect as they can be, and I'm just one person. I don't ever want to be the person to do that kind of thing. I only ever want to write original characters that I come up with.
That's a cool perspective, and definitely admirable and fine choice. There's no wrong way to write, and doing all your own work is definitely a fine one.
Yeah. All right, well, I think we've reached the end of our discussion here. I hope you found that informative or entertaining, or you found that interesting in some way. Please give it a like, give it a favorite, share it around, give me feedback, give me a comment. I don't care if it's bad, I don't care if it's good. Tell me what I did right, tell me what I did wrong, tell me anything that I did so I can improve this podcast. I always am looking to make this better for anybody who wants to listen. Please tell me anything. This has been the Best Book Club, episode whatever. I don't know what episode number we're at now. And this has been Seselum, aka Nufatora, Hans Gutherson. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having
once
me
again. The always perfect guest to have on a podcast.
Thank you.
Never failed to disappoint.
Never failed to disappoint? Wow.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. That was a complete wrong choice.
At least I'm consistent.
Never fail to impress.
Hey.
And never fail to get his point across. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you again for having me. Always wonderful to chat with you.
And we will see you on the next episode. At least I will. If not.
Bye, everyone.